Right. So otherwise, if you could just keep your microphones muted throughout the talk, that way David will be able to get through his talk without too much background noise, because there are quite a few of us here to listen to his talk tonight. Otherwise, feel free to pop any questions that you have throughout the talk in the chat, and we can answer them at the end. I'll keep track of where they were asked throughout the talk. And also feel free to just pop your, an introduction in the chat to say hi, to let people know where you're watching and listening from. And I think that's just about it for the technical side. So now onto the fun bit, I would like to introduce David Weinczok. Really strong online presence, better known as the Castle Hunter. He's also a digital media producer with National Museums Scotland. And today he's going to be speaking to us about Crookston and Ardrossan castles and what they have to tell us about 15th century politics in Scotland. So I'm going to pass over to you, David.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming along. If you have been to any of my previous talks, this one's going to be a little bit different. I will be reading from a condensed version of my dissertation, which I did at the University of Stirling. I've rather than going off the cuff, that's going to be the style of this one. A bit more academic than usual. I probably won't even mention Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. Sorry to disappoint. I know that's been a big draw in the past, but hey, there we are. So before we get stuck in, I obviously just want to say thanks to everyone at Dundonald Castle, the whole team, for organizing this lecture as well as the whole series, and to Blythe as well for getting me prepped and being on hand for when I inevitably freeze with a really goofy look on my face at some point during the talk. So get prepared for that. Just want to say thanks as well to my supervisor for the dissertation that this talk is based on, who is Professor Richard Oram, again at the University of Stirling. So let's get started. I'll share my screen. Do you have a slideshow for you? And it's just saying that screen sharing is disabled. Right, there we go. Thank you, Blythe. Saving the day already. There we are. So I'll get this into full screen. And that should be coming through now. All good? Excellent, thank you. So a little bit of background to this. Before I studied history, my research really focused on politics and international relations. Politics and history obviously can be a very, very messy mix, but they are inseparable. One simply can't exist without the other. Now, don't worry, we're dealing with the 15th century, so I'm not going to be bringing up any recent headlines, but just thought I'd put that in there because this talk is going to be partially about political society and partially about castle architecture. So hopefully a little bit in there for everyone. I've always been interested in power structures, how they form, gain momentum, and sustain themselves. And those questions are always on my mind when I'm studying history. That's what led me to the topic that we'll be discussing today. And what that topic is centered around is this idea that I encountered over and over and over again in reading various works of Scottish castle studies. It's this notion that as the crown got more powerful, nobles slowly realized that basically they couldn't compete with the crown. Power became more and more centralized. And so they gave up the arms race, as it's often referred to, stopped building proper castles and started building themselves country houses and chateaus riddled with large windows and things that some people would argue aren't really castles, but I would argue it's a much more complex scene than that infers. McGibbon and Ross in the late 19th century really summed it up quite well, and that's where a lot of this idea comes from in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. McGibbon and Ross wrote that gradually people did away with the ponderous and gloomy walls which surrounded them and opened them up for their own pleasure and comfort. More recently, Chris Taberham wrote in A Military History of Scotland that castles were the product of a feudal society. So long as they remained centres from which land and people were ruled, they remained essential military targets. But as the governance of the nation changed over the centuries, so fortified lordly residences became anachronisms. As national government became stronger, so the notion of a permanent standing army took root. Gone was the age of the private retainer fighting in the defense of the lord and his castle. We'll see about that. This is Tantallon Castle, often regarded as one of the last truly great curtain wall defensive castles built in Scotland. And throughout the talk, I'll be throwing up some pretty castle pictures just to give you a bit of context and something nice to look at while I'm chatting away. So this research project that the dissertation I wrote was based around was really sort of focused on the tenacity of this narrative, coupled with the pretty obvious lack of thorough justifications for it. It seems to be a pretty widely accepted idea that as power became more centralized, castles sort of gave up the game. But I had never encountered a really thorough explanation for the specific factors that scholars considered when they made this claim. So that's one part of what we'll be talking about today. Rather than trying to prove or debunk the theory of centralisation and the end of the castle age, though, my goal is more to ask, okay, I can take this idea on board, but what specifically do you mean by that? What institutions are involved? How are they supposedly becoming more centralised? And how might that manifest in castle architecture? And that's what the second part of this talk is about, is how these factors might have played out at individual castles, taking the examples, of course, of Crookston Castle and Ardrossan Castle. So a little bit about the methodology, everyone's favorite part of the talk in the paper, right? A lot of my research was guided on sort of deconstructing what Colin Platt referred to as the hoary old debate, which occupied castleologists for much of the 20th century, this binary between castles either being martial buildings or domestic buildings. It's a commonly held assumption that the earlier a castle was built, the more martial its architecture was, and the later a castle was built, the more concerned it was with ornamentation and domestic luxury. Proper castles, I keep using these air quotes, on one end, castle houses and chateau on the other. Seems intuitive, right? Here's an example of the contrast between the two that people would often call out, something like Hermitage Castle on the left on one side, this brooding fortress in the Scottish borders, and Craigievar Castle, one of the inspirations allegedly for the Disney Castle, which is up in Aberdeenshire with that lovely pink harling. I'd argue that the division between martial and domestic castles isn't really an especially helpful binary. Sarah Spate summed it up really well by observing that a modern preoccupation with form has distracted us from more interesting questions. If castles are one of the structures that represent lordship, what can the construction of castles of whatever form tell us about society at a certain period? The goal of this study is therefore not to provide an answer to the question of how late medieval castle architecture reflected changing political circumstances. Instead, it's to narrow down exactly what we mean by power centralization and to suggest an approach for applying those developments to specific castles. By no means am I saying this is the way to do it. It's just one possible door that we can explore this subject through. Now, the main problem with the whole conversation that we're going to have is intentionality. Geoffrey Stell criticized what he called the widespread tendency on our part to assume a builder's or occupant's immediate willingness and ability to suit the changing dictates on siege warfare, or to follow every changing breeze in the political and social climate. A castle's final form, if there is such a thing, is the product of many small alterations and inconsistent intentions, often accumulated over multiple generations, accounting for a huge diversity in tastes and individual priorities. And there's a running theme to all this. There is no silver bullet. Sorry, there just isn't. I would love for there to be, but that's just not how this works. That's the joys of nuanced historical investigation, after all. There's a great quote which sums this all up. It's an inscription on Pinkie House in Midlothian, which reads, Alexander Seton, Lord Seton, built this house in 1613, not as he would have wished, but according to the measure of his means and estate. Pretty practical. If that doesn't help us relate to people in the past as complex individuals rather than as pieces in a bigger narrative that we're looking back on, I don't know what will. So let's get on to some of the challenges of interpreting castles in this way. Here are two reconstructions, both by Andrew Spratt. The reason I'm relying on reconstructions here is because the castles that we'll be looking at, Ardrossan on the left and Crookston on the right, are far from fully intact now. So the big problem in studying this period is that no late medieval castle or great house survives intact or unaltered enough to let us see it exactly as it was during what I've referred to as the long 15th century. And all that term means, the long 15th century, is the 15th century plus or minus 20 years on either side, just to give us a little bit of wiggle room, because As much as we want it to, history doesn't actually divide itself up neatly into 100-year blocks. There also isn't any original documentation that survives to give us an account of how and why castles all came together. There's no stunning insight, no journal entry from a castle builder that puts down in writing, this is exactly what I had in mind when I designed it this way or asked for it to be built this way. So there's no statement of intent. That means everything that we do really has to be an exercise in inference. Now, why Crookston and Ardrossan castles? Both are located in the relative southwest of Scotland in an area historically referred to as the Westlands. Coffee is very, very crucial to keep you going through this. Hope you've all got a nice hot cuppa as well. Their relative proximity, Crookston and Ardrossan castles, means that we aren't comparing two castles from totally different geopolitical or cultural theaters. Both castles were also built by families, the Darnley Stuarts in the case of Crookston Castle and the Montgomerys of Ardrossan, obviously in the case of Ardrossan Castle, were examples of what we call late medieval new men, meaning individuals who already occupied positions of relatively high status in society, but who were inducted into the peerage in Parliament and eventually attained the title of Earl during the long 15th century. So they started reasonably high up, but they weren't at the top yet at the time that their castles were built. This provides a common thread of political ascendancy, which may prove instructive when deciphering how that rise in status was articulated at their main residences. Here a lot of these will be my own photos, some of them better cropped than others, apologies in advance. Both Crookston and Ardrossan castles underwent major architectural changes during the long 15th century, resulting in the castles that we see and interpret today, barring destruction and the ravages of time, of course, that you can see very evidently in these images. Another reason for choosing these two castles for this particular study was that, again, neither are in the highest tier of Scottish castle, arguably. They're not royal, and their size is relatively modest compared to other major baronial castles, especially the ones that tend to pop up on the tourist trails and which we're all probably familiar with. Sarah Spate, again, an excellent scholar who I drew on a lot for this research, observed that the range of castles used by political historians is an elite one. Crichton and Lydiard, writing in 2008, emphasized the need to give more scholarly attention to relatively less well-known non-royal castles by calling for a healthy dose of mundanity. Now, I would never describe either castle as mundane, but their relative obscurity helps avoid that top tier selection bias. So how did the idea that castles responded to political society gain traction? We've already hinted at this. It starts, as with so many things in Scottish castle studies, with McGibbon and Ross. David McGibbon and Thomas Ross's 5-volume The Castellated and Domestic Architecture of Scotland was published between 1887 and 1892. In it, they presented a very step-like, almost evolutionary morphology of progressive castle architecture. In their own words, each building or portion of a building was in its appropriate niche, as was the contemporary fashion in fields such as biology and sociology. So the intellectual environment that they were working in is very important for how they conceived of the historical development of Scotland's castles. Their historiography clearly laid out the notion that pre-Union Scotland was an exceptionally violent place, a narrative that we encounter over and over again and which has been pretty thoroughly debunked at this point. They argued that it was riddled with these grim bastions, which slowly and rather reluctantly their lords or lairds converted into more civilized and more domestic architectural styles. They specifically identified the consolidation of royal authority in the late medieval and early modern periods as the catalyst for the end of the castle age. In this way, they planted the seed of the idea that political history and castle architecture are fundamentally intertwined, just within what I would refer to as a fairly Whiggish framework of social progress that has since been pretty thoroughly debunked. Writing in the mid-20th century, scholars like W.D. Simpson were influential in guiding castle studies towards a broader, what we would call sociological approach, arguing that castles were not just utilitarian functional structures, but physical embodiments of a nobleman's mental concept of his lordship and status. So here's where symbolism comes into the play. And you find a lot of that architectural symbolism at places like Fyvie, Castle, with all its wonderful turrets. That frontage is really an expression of authority and wealth if I've ever seen it. So going even further than scholars like W.D. Simpson, Charles Colson's socio-architectural approach rejected the supposedly linear progress from martial to domestic architecture altogether. For Colson, castles of every period were just as concerned with ornamentation and symbolism as with defense, what he termed a status-enhancing iconography of lordship. A wave of scholars in the late 1990s and 2000s went even further from castle studies' origins. They threw out the binary categorization altogether, attempting to overcome that old debate between martial and domestic. Matthew Johnson, for instance, argued that any medieval building, in fact, represents the coming together of a whole set of agencies and intentions, and is never the unproblematic product of a single intention. It's a lot messier than that, I would agree. A better way forward, they argued, was to take a more individualistic, or in Robert Higham's words, a circumstance-specific approach. It's this tradition that my own research largely lies within. However, I don't reject intentionality altogether. I do think we can infer what was possibly going on. We can theorize about wider social forces that influenced people without getting bogged down in some of those old binaries that held up castle studies for so long. So let's get into this idea of political centralization in the 15th century. How has it been theorized? What supposedly characterized it? And does it hold up? So this idea fundamentally comes down to the notion that the true destroyer of castles was not gunpowder, as sort of represented by Mons Meg there, but central government. There are a few issues with this interpretation. It assumes that the late medieval crown and the nobility held completely distinct and conflicting interests, and that the crown steadily gained power in a zero-sum fashion at the expense of the nobility. It also accepts that there is a discernible trend of what many people would refer to as decline in castle architecture, and that the decline is represented by the ascendancy of domestic over defensive architecture. It also accepts that changes in castle architecture were undertaken as conscious responses to political trends. Now, when you're making an extension on your house, I don't know how frequently you consider the political society that you're living in. Why should we assume that people in the past did the same? So that's something to bear in mind. The conventional narrative of power relations in medieval Scotland imagines a centuries-long zero-sum game of cat and mouse. More recently, though, scholarship has challenged that notion and argued that the interests of the crown and nobility weren't always at odds. In fact, they could often be complementary. Alexander Grant has further questioned whether Scots lairds asserted any sense of collective identity, which again makes this idea of the king, or the crown, versus nobles problematic. But going even further, and most notably, Alice Taylor and Jenny Wormold argued that it's more realistic to conceive of royal and aristocratic power as distinct yet often complementary spheres. So that's just sort of a caveat to what we're going to get into. Now let's examine 15th century political society specifically. What do we really mean when we say that politics became more centralized in late medieval Scotland? Well, one way, arguably, that this is expressed is in the crown becoming what is referred to as the natural focus of political activity. When I say the crown, by the way, I mean the crown as an institution, not as embodied by any particular monarch. Throughout Western Europe, we can fairly say that the mid-14th through mid-15th centuries saw a tightening of central jurisdictions over those of lesser rulers and subjects. So this wasn't something that was just going on in Scotland. This was going on throughout the medieval world. In Scotland, several scholars look to King James I specifically as a real turning point. His 18 years as a prisoner of the Lancastrians exposed him to a greater degree of control exercised by English and French monarchs, and his return to Scotland resulted in sweeping efforts to reduce the power of territorial magnates. By his reign, there was also a tradition of national propaganda in the form of works like Barbour's The Bruce, which Katie Stevenson called a suite of history, a mythology, and documentation of the Stuarts' legitimacy to possess the throne and their authority to rule. Walter Bauer's Scotichronicon really sums up this idea by referring to the magnet class as treacherous and vile wolves. So here we really see the seed of this narrative taking place not just in modern castle studies, but back into the late 14th and 15th centuries. Here we have Falkland Palace, which was one of a number of royal building programs instigated from James I right through to James V, which emphasized the widening gap in resources and prestige attainable for the crown relative to even the wealthiest and most powerful members of the nobility. So it does seem that the gap was widening, just in terms of the material realities of what the crown and what the nobility or aristocracy could achieve. But we can't take this too far. There's caveats to everything. That's the name of the game here. J.H. Burns said that kings found themselves in a landscape, an expression I really like, rather than as puppeteers on a stage, a landscape that no sovereign could ever entirely impose their will on. Was the ideology of absolutism a conscious effort on their part, or might it just seem that way in retrospect? Another factor that was arguably underway, again looking to James I as a real instigator of this, is the end, or at least the beginning of the end, of the territorial basis for lordship. I would argue this is the single most consequential change in power structures in late medieval Scotland. A fundamental principle of lordship in Scotland and throughout the medieval world was that power was tied to a specific territory. Lordship specifically was tied to a specific territory. But by the 15th century, this started to change. A half dozen earls dominated the upper ranks of the nobility at the start of the 15th century, but by the 1480s, 30 to 40 lesser lords had taken their place. Big heads rolled, often literally, with King James I's reign again being especially notable in this regard. The Albany Stuarts and Lennox's lands were forfeited in 1425. Ross was wrested from Alexander and of the Isles in 1429, and Mar ceded to the crown in 1435. The earldom of Dunbar was also forfeited in that year. So the big picture is seemingly a shift to what scholars, including Katie Stevenson, have called a completely new structure of the nobility. That's a pretty dramatic statement. It seems like a sort of stepping stone path to power emerged during the 15th century. Members of the greater baronage were made into lords of parliament, and eventually they and their heirs acquired comital status, became earls, which was mostly an honorific term by the end of the 15th century. This is true of the builders of both Crookston and Ardrossan castles, the Darnley Stuarts and Montgomerys of Ardrossan, respectively. Both the regions of Renfrew and Cunningham, home to Crookston and Ardrossan, were provincial lordships established by David I. Most of these lordships endured into the 15th century, yet by 1424, the majority had deferred to earls or the crown. Only 4, the Isles, Lorne, Nithsdale, and Strathbogie, were still held by provincial lords. Most of the new earldoms created in the 15th century had little direct relationship with their geographical estates. They were also granted almost exclusively to men who were recently made Lords of Parliament. So it's probably important to ask what was going on in Parliament, and that is arguably another factor at play here. By the 1450s, under James II, Jenny Wormalds argued that the peerage had changed beyond recognition. More and more, what we see is direct service to the crown as a ticket to being a member or Lord of Parliament. This is definitely true for the Montgomerys of Ardrossan, but the Darnley Stuarts are, as with most things, a little bit more complicated. The rank of Lord of Parliament appeared in the middle of the 15th century. One of its perks was that you got an individual summons to attend Parliament. So you actually got an invitation in your name to show up. Before this, anyone who bothered to show up to Parliament was technically a Lord of Parliament. Now it was a more exclusive invitation-only club. What isn't clear is what material perks this conferred on a newly minted Lord of Parliament. It didn't necessarily come with land, incomes, or anything else, really. By the early 16th century, that changed, but for most of the 15th century, the sole prize of becoming a Lord of Parliament seemed to be access to an increasingly exclusive patronage-based club. Parliament was also summoned less and less throughout the 15th century. Under James IV, annual or even regular parliaments were a thing of the past, and that meant less accountability. From June 1496 to March 1504, James didn't summon a single parliament. This is what Norman MacDougall called a watershed moment for Parliament, putting it more in line with how putting the Scottish Parliament rather more in line with how English and continental monarchies were playing down representative assemblies. So a few brief conclusions about the centralisation process. There's so much more that we can get into. I think that's a little bit premature, that slide, but enjoy a battle scene, why not? So let's sum up the political side. A significant array of scholarship seems to support the idea that there were indeed substantive changes in the political environment in the Kingdom of Scotland underway in the long 15th century. However, it's not as simple as king beats noble. It was a more nuanced and non-linear process, which reinforced an interdependency between royal and noble authority, rather than the unilateral supremacy of the crown. We'll see this in the exercise of patronage, especially in the case of the Montgomerys of Ardrossan soon. There was no single watershed moment at which we can say, ha, now power is irrevocably centralized in the monarchy. Arguably, it never was. More important for the political historian is the cumulative effect of multiple processes, including the reconstruction of the higher nobility, the collapse of the territorial basis of noble power, and an increasingly honorific social ranking system. Now let's get on to the two castles and the families that made them. And this is why I've got this battle scene up, because we're now going to be talking about the Darnley Stuarts. They were certainly no strangers to national or even international affairs. A branch of the royal Stuart family, the Darnley Stuarts' power was primarily in the southwest of Scotland into Renfrew and the area around the Clyde. As just one example of their clout, in 1419, Sir John Stuart of Darnley joined his cousin, the Earl of Buchan, to lead a 6,000 strong army to France. By 1420, John was made constable of the Scots in France, and his role in the Franco-Scottish victory at the Battle of Baugé, which is what we see here, led the Dauphin and soon-to-be King Charles VII of France to give Darnley the lordships of Concresson and Aubigny-Sonière. This made the Darnley Stuarts' holdings in France even more illustrious, especially from a reputational perspective, than their Scottish lands and titles. Then there's the little issue of rebellion. In 1489, the Darnley Stuarts revolted against the crown. The royal hammer came down swiftly, declaring the Darnley Stuarts' land forfeit and forbidding any other members of the nobility from associating with them. The king personally led a force to Crookston, defeating the Earl of Lennox at the Battle of Gartloning and besieged the rebels at Dumbarton, which you can see here from Sleator's view. It was all over by December 1489, but amazingly after this, the Darnleys were pretty quickly forgiven for their major role in this rebellion. Their castles were restored to them, though at a cost. Much of the destruction of Crookston Castle that we still see today was likely done as a punitive measure after this rebellion. Overall, the idea of harmonious relations between the Darnley Stuarts and the crown is much harder to maintain than between the Montgomerys of Ardrossan and the crown. It's another example of why it's important to consider the specific circumstances of each family and castle when we're talking about power politics and castle architecture. Now to Crookston Castle itself. It's always a bit more atmospheric with some crows flying around, isn't it? Standing atop a steep hill in what is now the Crookston suburb of Glasgow, archaeologist Derek Alexander described Crookston Castle as perhaps the most impressive of all the towers in the old county of Renfrewshire. The first castle was built by Sir Robert de Crock, hence the name Crock's Town, Crookston, and Robert Crock was a vassal of Walter Fitzalan in the 12th century. His castle was an earth and timber ringwork, and its ditches and slopes are still a major feature of the site today. This is a plan of the stone tower built much later, but you can still see the very impressive earthworks which are a major part of the site. It's very likely that there was actually an even earlier Iron Age fortification already on what became known as Castle Hill, which was also the case for nearby Camp Hill in what is now Queen's Park. The lands passed to the Stuarts of Darnley in the 1330s. The period between then and the early 15th century is unfortunately a historical blind spot for Crookston. We simply don't know what the castle looked like during that period or what changes the Darnley Stuarts made to Crock's Castle. Who built the stone castle whose ruins we see today? No one knows for sure. W.D. Simpson favored John Stuart of French fame, but the discovery of a silver groat of Robert III, issued between 1393 and 1406 in the foundations of the Southwest Tower, make John's father, Alexander Stuart, the most likely suspect. In Alexander's time, the Darnley Stuarts held many estates and castles throughout Ayrshire, Lanarkshire, the Lothians, and Annandale. Crookston seems to have held pride of place amongst these until it was made a secondary residence in favour of the now vanished palace at Inchinnan in 1506. Crookston Castle invites comparison with a lot of other Scottish castles, and specifically with Hermitage Castle, Borthwick Castle, and indeed Dundonald Castle, especially when it comes to how it segregated social space inside its walls. The interiors of castles weren't just designed for convenience or strength. A lord could convey their status to guests in all kinds of ways, in what castleologists have referred to as architectural theatrics. The intention is to make it clear where guests stand in relation to the lord of the castle, and indeed where members of the lord's own household stood in relation to each other. Richard Oram, who again supervised my dissertation, describes two major ways that this was achieved in Scotland's late medieval castles and towers. One is the two towers solution. I kind of evoked Lord of the Rings there, couldn't help it, but it's the two towers solution, as seen here in the picture at Doune Castle, where the Lord occupies one tower and his household and guests occupy a second tower. Usually connected by a courtyard, not always. There are different means by which the towers can be connected on a case-by-case basis. Ardrossan Castle definitely fits into this category, and we will come back to that. The second option is the complex household under one roof model, where services, residences, and public space were contained within one huge ensemble. Examples of this type include Borthwick, Hermitage, and Dundonald castles, hence the common comparisons between Crookston and those sites. So that, at least at first glance, describes Crookston fairly well, but let's take a closer look. Oh, there we go, I've got Dundonald in there. Just a quick look. Crookston Castle's entrance was and still is on the ground level. It's protected by a portcullis raised from an intramural chamber accessed from the hall above. From the entrance to the castle, you could go straight ahead and access a vaulted basement, or head up to the right, up a vaulted staircase to the first floor. On the first floor, you have two options once again. You can follow a dog-legged passage to the kitchen, buttery, and pantry in the northwest and southwest tower jambs, or you could pass through a screen into Crookston's primary public space, a very well-equipped hall where you can still see a large fireplace and stone seats by the windows. The problem of survival is a big one here, because there's nothing left of two out of the castle's four corner towers beyond the hall level. What's pretty clear, though, is that the kitchen and service rooms were not sufficient for a castle the size of Crookston and a lordly household as powerful as that of the Darnley Stuarts. These functions were almost certainly fulfilled by secondary structures outside the main tower block. At the east end of the hall, nearest where the highest status people would have sat, is a stairway, the only way that survives, at least, of accessing the northeast and southeast towers. These towers are where the highest status accommodation was. This suggests that there was a very deliberate restriction of access. Not just anyone could make their way beyond the hall. These towers survived the destruction wrought on Crookston after the Lennox Rebellion, but the service towers, as I mentioned before, did not. You can see the extent of the destruction here. Crookston is rather unusual in having a corner tower, so four big corner towers, and you can see that we've really only got substantive remains of one here, a bit less of the other, and almost nothing of two beyond that ground level. One possibility that I'm toying with, this is far from definitive, is that the king, James IV, could possibly have ordered the service towers to be destroyed to hit the Darnley Stuarts where it hurt, in their ability to offer services to the degree that high status lords and guests would have demanded while staying with them. Perhaps this was a way of hitting the Darnley Stuarts' social status in a time when relationships of patronage and between high-ranking nobility were increasingly important. Or maybe the Darnley Stuarts volunteered these towers for destruction as a sign of submission after the rebellion. Spare the Lord's quarters and blow up the service towers. After all, there was plenty of space on Castle Hill for other buildings to fulfill those service functions. It seems that Crookston Castle roughly followed the same general philosophy behind the two more well-known Stuart castles of Doon and Dundonald, which had increasing degrees of privacy and status on each level. In this way, the limited access and narrow corridors of Crookston Castle conveyed the Darnley Stuarts' ability and social right to strictly control the movement of even high-status guests within their walls. It's a bit cheeky, but very effective. Now on to this idea of outbuildings, which is not something that is discussed very much when we're dealing with Crookston Castle. I would argue that it should be. The myth of the Lone Tower has long been busted. Popular imagination likes to imagine castles as solitary sentries when, in reality, they were often at the center of bustling communities and castle towns. This was proved beyond doubt by Chris Tabraham's excavations of Threave Castle in the late 1970s, which revealed a thriving settlement alongside the castle. That's the reconstruction that you are now looking at. In fact, the castle town, was necessary for the other, the castle. Without the castle, the settlement wouldn't have existed, and without the settlement, the castle could never have fed or maintained itself. There simply is not enough space for those activities to be conducted within the castle proper, as we often refer to it. To go even further, the term the castle, I would argue, should really apply to the whole system, not just to the tower at the core of such a complex. Chris Tabraham asked, following on from these excavations, can we sustain this argument for the existence of large settlements and secondary structures as we move down the social scale to the lesser nobility and landed gentry? I would argue that the case of Crookston Castle shows that we can. Every artistic and photographic depiction of Crookston shows the castle standing alone. Excavations in 1973-5 and a geophysical survey in 1998 to 1999, however, show that it was anything but. The Castle Hill in the late medieval period was a busy place with many secondary structures, including a chapel, several residential blocks, a likely guardhouse, a latrine tower, luxury, a stone causeway traversing the earthen ditch around the castle, and possibly even a wall enclosing the entire site, none of which is visible if you visit the site today. The secondary buildings were also no trifling things. One measured 5.3 meters by 4.1 meters, and it had a large fireplace, while a rectangular apartment possibly had a hall on the ground level for entertainment. While the date for their construction is imprecise, they were likely built around the same time as the stone tower in the very late 14th or early 15th centuries. This gives you an idea of what the excavations reveal. That's just one small slice of Castle Hill, and there were stone structures found all around the tower that we see today. There is no evidence for stone structures on the Castle Hill prior to the Darnley Stuarts taking charge. Could the fortunes made by John Stuart and France have helped to finance these new builds? It's perhaps telling that Alan Stuart, John's successor, appended the fleur-de-lis to a charter issued from Crookston in 1429. He also, for the first time, used the French spelling of Stuart, S-T-U-A-R-T. Clearly, Alan wanted everyone to know about the family's French connections. Could Crookston Castle itself, perhaps started by Alexander and continued by his heirs, have been an expression of this newfound authority and influence? It's of course also possible that the stone structures on Castle Hill were built later than the tower, or indeed that they were gradually added to over the decades. There's nothing that requires them to have all been built at once. In fact, that would probably be pretty unlikely. The later 15th century, however, was a very turbulent time in the Lennox and for the Darnley Stuarts. We mentioned the rebellion, and despite many people thinking of castles as instruments of war, it was actually far easier to build them in times of peace. The early to mid 15th century offered just that, at least relatively. So the picture of Crookston Castle is one where the internal space of the main tower was carefully orchestrated to convey status, power, and control. All castles were to some degree, but the Darnley Stuarts seem to have gone to extra effort to reinforce this messaging. The secondary structures around the tower were almost exclusively for accommodation and services, making Crookston a castle worthy of its ascendant lords, as well as of guests of very high status, even if, when the king finally did visit, he came for a fight rather than a feast. Let's now move on to consider Ardrossan Castle and the Montgomerys of Ardrossan. So the story of the Montgomerys of Ardrossan, much more so than the Darnley Stewarts, is inseparable from their support for the crown, which is one of the reasons why I chose Ardrossan as a case study. There's way too many examples of that to mention in detail here, but here are a few highlights. Sir John Montgomery captured Henry Hotspur at the Battle of Otterburn in 1388, and he used the ransom from Hotspur to build a castle at Polnoon. The same John Montgomery acted as one of the leaders of the campaign that ended, admittedly, in disaster at Homildon Hill, and he later served as one of the noble hostages sent to England as part of the ransom for the captured King James I. John was also one of 6 barons at the trial of the Duke of Albany and the Earl of Lennox at Stirling in 1452. John's heir, Alexander, and yes, there are, based on my research, only about 5 names kicking around at this point. It's John, it's Alexander, a handful of others. I'm sure you all are familiar with this. John put down a revolt in the Isles and was made a member of the Privy Council, as well as given joint commission over Kintyre and Knapdale, including the castles of Skipness and Sween. Little chunk of Ardrossan Castle here. That last bit is important because the historical evidence points to the Montgomerys of Ardrossan drawing much of their authority and future aspirations from the waterways around the Clyde. John Montgomery was granted permission by Henry IV of England to engage in international trade, which he did with 2 vessels, La Winine with 16 mariners and another unnamed vessel, which apparently had 10 mariners. John's mother, Agnes, was the daughter of John of Islay, First Lord of the Isles. He was a Gaelic speaker, and a West Highland casket carved from whalebone was kept at his other residence of Eglinton Castle, just a few miles from Ardrossan. Here it is, compliments of National Museum Scotland. John especially, but the Montgomerys more generally, operated in a geopolitical theatre on which waterways of the West and the castles guarding them were their priority. Not only that, their power over these areas were unambiguously tied to faithful service to the crown. In 1445, Alexander Montgomery, John's son, was made a Lord of Parliament, a promotion that a key but admittedly biased source, the Memorials of the Earls of Eglinton, attributes to, quote, the important public service of Sir Alexander, which seems to have been neither overlooked nor undervalued by his royal masters. This ascension often came at others' direct expense. In the mid-late 15th century, the Montgomerys were embroiled in a bitter feud with the Cunninghams and Boyds, 2 other prominent Ayrshire families, over conflicting claims to the Bailey area of Cunningham. This dispute carried into the 1480s, arguably the most volatile decade of the 15th century, with 3 major rebellions in 1482, 1488, culminating at the Battle of Sauchiehburn, and 1489. At Sauchiehburn, Hugh Montgomery, Lord of Ardrossan, fought for the rebel prince. His arch-rival, Alexander Cunningham, took King James III's side. The prince triumphed and Cunningham was killed, possibly by Montgomery's own hand in the thick of the fighting. For aiding the prince, now King James IV, Montgomery was forgiven for breaking the peace and destroying the Cunningham Castle of Turnlaw earlier that year. Hugh showed up for James's first parliament and received numerous rewards, including the power to put down theft, robbery, and murder in Carrick, Kyle, Ayr, and Cunningham himself, a pretty broad swathe of lands. He was also given life grants to lands on Arran and Bute, which later included the very mighty castle of Rothsay, pictured here, on an especially lovely day with swans. With the king's favor firmly on his side, Hugh Montgomery was able to act with, frankly, shocking impunity. By late 1489, he had assassinated the heads of 2 of the leading families of Ayrshire, James Boyd and Robert Crawford of Auchencairn, securing his grip on that part of the country. Far from being punished, he was elevated to the rank of Earl in 1506. This is an example of how direct patronage from the king, while not a guarantee of success, definitely improved the odds. Hugh wasn't present at the Battle of Flodden, where his king and so many of his contemporaries died, and that put him in the perfect position to influence James V during that king's long minority rule. He became the young king's tutor, gained more land grants, regularly attended and influenced Parliament, and was named a joint governor of Scotland in 1537. It was quite a long and illustrious political career. With such a conspicuous role in the politics of the realm, the Montgomerys of Ardrossan were, like any members of noble society, intensely conscious of their position in the political state, but also of their place in society. It's hard to imagine that the manifestations of their power, gained through loyal service to the crown for the most part, did not in some way reflect this relationship. But how? That's the kicker. On to Ardrossan Castle proper. No study of Ardrossan Castle could proceed without credit to David Caldwell. He's president of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, of which I'm a fellow, and he was the first as a teenager, which is very daunting if you're a historical researcher, to do a meticulous study of the castle and what a study it was. It really put the pieces together in a way that no other historical work had done to date. He's also, I would like to also thank the Ardrossan Castle Heritage Society, who I was in communication with while writing my dissertation, but unfortunately COVID threw a massive spanner in the works, and I was not actually able to visit either Crookston or Ardrossan castles during the time that I was writing the dissertation. I'd been to both plenty of times before, but unfortunately while I was actually writing it, couldn't make it. So I promised to make up for that as soon as possible. As the Montgomerys' main seat until at least the mid-15th century, Ardrossan Castle would have, to some degree, been an articulation of the identity and ambition of a family whose political trajectory was trending upward. Ardrossan Castle's first explicit appearance in the historical record was in 1484, fairly late, but a castle existed on the hill in Ardrossan for several centuries before that. Famously, and arguably, William Wallace is said to have slaughtered its English garrison, hence the room which is known as Wallace's larder. Whatever its earlier form was, Ardrossan Castle was altered considerably during the long 15th century. This period aligns primarily with what David Caldwell referred to as Phase 3 and Phase 4 of the site's history, and there were really three major developments that characterized the changes. The first was what, in Caldwell's own words, was the spinning back to front of the entire castle complex. The gatehouse tower of the 14th century ceased to be a gatehouse. The entrance was blocked up, and the tower that contained it only became accessible through the castle's courtyard, barring the slight possibility that it retained a function as a small postern gate. Another big development was the building of an entire second tower, now known as the Kitchen Tower, at the south end of the castle complex nearest the shore. This greatly enhanced the provision of services and accommodation in the castle and raises questions about the social division of space within it. Recall the two towers arrangement discussed earlier. That's the form that Ardrossan Castle from this time onwards definitively took. Caldwell places its construction broadly within Phase 3, and a 2015 report for Rathmell Archaeology narrowed the time frame between the late 15th and early 16th centuries for the construction of this kitchen tower. This second tower allowed guests independent space. They could host their core household in one place altogether, but not independent access. Any high status guests could keep to themselves within the kitchen tower, but would always have been aware of the fact that the Montgomerys ultimately held the keys to the whole complex, a household within a household, as it were. Caldwell again makes a direct link between the kitchen tower and the Montgomerys' projection of status, stating that the tower, as well as the north and west ranges within Ardrossan's courtyard, as fully realized, could have provided opportunities for the Montgomery lords to entertain at a level commensurate with their status, which was ever growing. Party in the new place, sleep in the old, if you want to put it that way. The personal chambers of the Montgomery lords remained in the old gatehouse tower. While you might think that they would want to occupy the new tower, staying in the old one conferred those priceless status-enhancing assets, antiquity and continuity. That's not to say it went unchanged, of course. The tower's barrel-vaulted pen was made into space divided in two and used for storage, with a well-appointed chamber on the third and uppermost level provided with a large fireplace, a slit window with seating, a substantial chimney, and a recess in the floor likely used for storing documents and other valuables. Leading from point one, the castle got a new entrance. It was reoriented and you needed a new way to get in based on that reorientation. So let's focus in on that, because I would argue this is probably the most telling factor from a political perspective for what was going on in the Montgomerys' heads. Of course, this is all speculative, but that's the best we can do with the resources we have. The old entrance was a grand one. It was 3.5 meters wide and easily high enough for a high status rider on a horse to pass through. Skipness Castle in Apdale, which we're looking at now, boasts a similar entrance, which you can see at the far side of the courtyard. And it's worth noting that not only was it a relatively short day's sailing from Ardrossan to Skipness, but Skipness was also given as a joint commission to Sir Alexander Montgomery around the same time that Ardrossan was being redeveloped. Did he get a little inspiration from his castle at Skipness? This hints at a tantalizing prospect. In what other ways did Alexander Montgomery draw from the world of Gallic galley castles? He controlled several of them, and we've already established his deep Gallic roots. Caldwell argues, and I would agree, that with this reorientation, Ardrossan Castle became a part of the world of the galley castle, projecting its authority out towards the waterways and the lands that formed the Montgomerys' expanding realm of influence. There's no architectural evidence for the location of Ardrossan's new entrance, but what if it faced the sea? Rather than facing a landward approach, the entrance to the castle may have faced the direction from which the Montgomerys drew much of their authority and where they hoped to expand it. It's symbolic and practical. In the 15th century, the waters were much nearer to the base of the castle hill than they are today. An entrance to the south would have given easier access to the Montgomery ships and served as a sort of beacon to any coming across the waves to treat with them. It's speculative, admittedly, but that's what this research is all about, drawing on developments in political society to infer what might have influenced Scotland's castle builders. One event in the castle's history shows that this reorientation may well have paid off. In 1546, Ardrossan Castle played host to a meeting of the Privy Council. This is obviously not a meeting of the Privy Council. This is me being bemused because that was the first time I was able to get to Ardrossan several months after I had finished the dissertation. So there I was catching up with something I had written lots about, but after it did me any good for actually writing this. So hence my mixed emotions upon visiting. Anyway, the meeting of the Privy Council was a pretty remarkable occasion, as there were very few occasions when the Privy Council met anywhere outside the usual locations, namely Edinburgh and Stirling. In attendance were the Earl of Arran, the Bishop of Orkney, the Earl of Argyll, the Earl of Cassilis, the Abbot of Paisley, the Abbot of Cooper, the brother of the Earl of Angus, and the Chief of Clany and more, who held lands in Islay, Kintyre, and the north of Ireland. This was a gathering of major powers, as geopolitics rooted in the West, with many of the attendees arriving by ship, hence the reconstruction that's just appeared on your screen of a Berlin by Bob Marshall. It is not known how many people were in these nobles' retinues, and it's possible they convened in the church on Castle Hill rather than in the castle itself. Many would have camped out with the castle complex proper, though given the standard of accommodation available in Ardrossan Castle's kitchen tower, it's very likely that some of the high status attendees and their higher status servants were given rooms within the castle complex. The fact that such a gathering occurred at Ardrossan at all is a testament to the Montgomerys having fulfilled their ambition of building and maintaining a residence suitable for hosting the higher ranks of the nobility and enjoying it themselves, of course, even if they were only relatively recent inductees into that higher rank themselves. Once again, we find that one of the key perceptions of castle status went beyond its martial strength and into its ability to give its lord a way to develop social relationships and project symbolic authority. We're getting towards some tentative conclusions here, so I'll just put up the side-by-side of Crookston and Ardrossan and walk you through them. This study, and even the full dissertation that it's based on, is much too short to draw sweeping conclusions about anything, really. But there are a few things we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence. The long 15th century does indeed seem to be a time in which processes of political consolidation, whether self-aware or incidental, were underway, particularly in the reorganization of noble society. Power does appear to have gravitated towards the monarchy during this period, but not as part of a zero-sum game at the necessary expense of the nobility. It's perhaps more appropriate to conceive of the shift in power as a renegotiation instead of a domination. This renegotiation was expressed through increasingly formalized systems of patronage, the detaching of noble titles from territorially cohesive lordships, and a heightened stratification in the institutions of governance of the realm, such as Parliament. Crookston Castle's development in the 15th century speaks to Orham's observation that in many castles, the castle proper was only one part of a much larger system, one in which the main tower is the high status residential core around which ancillary structures, including service buildings and additional accommodation, were clustered. The fact that the stone tower at Crookston was built entirely within the very, very late 14th or early 15th centuries makes it an especially compelling case study. Its internal arrangement appears to emphasize a strictly choreographed social division of space. If there is merit to the idea that the Stuart castles of Dundonald and Doon influenced the design of Crookston, which is debatable, it shows how the Darnley Stuarts were possibly emulating their more senior family members' household organization in an attempt to stand alongside them in social rank, which eventually they did. At the same time, the capacity to provide high quality accommodation for the more senior members of their household and for visitors seems to have been a priority for late medieval castle builders, at least in these two cases. And we always have to be careful to be specific when we're talking about particular cases rather than applying this in broad strokes. At Ardrossan especially, a considerable portion of the castle complex was dedicated to this function. So one way we might say that 15th century political society influenced the Montgomerys of Ardrossan is with an emphasis on providing respectable accommodation and service for high-ranking visitors, so the Montgomerys could regularly participate in social functions that would elevate their status by association. However, we have to be careful not to see patterns for pattern's sake. The cases of Darnley Stuarts and the Montgomerys give us two families who shared the same political landscape, who inhabited the same general region of Scotland, and who broadly echoed each other's trajectories in terms of status, being elevated to Lords of Parliament and several decades later into the rank of Earl. Their castles of Crookston and Ardrossan might have strived towards some of the same goals, and yet they took two fairly distinct approaches. And what lies ahead for this project and any other research which tries to grapple with political society and castle architecture is really a reckoning with a core epistemological challenge encountered in any work of history, what Anthony Brundage calls history as story. It's tempting. Trajectories that follow a sensible narrative hold an innate appeal. The traditional framing of the history of Scottish castles as being fundamentally intertwined with the gradual absolutism of the monarchy, and eventually the emergence of the nation state, creates a trail leading to our present reality and castle's present condition. A trail which the builders and occupants of castles may never have envisioned or experienced themselves. To borrow the alluring metaphor of stagecraft once again, it is as though these two particular noble families' castles were actors in the same play, but reading from two different versions of the script. If we are to discuss castle architecture, not just in relation to the 15th century, but to any period of substantive political change, we have to be sensitive to that individuality. The result, I believe, can only be a more nuanced understanding of the often incoherent and therefore entirely human intentions behind them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was absolutely fascinating. Before we kick off questions, Amanda, who I think, Amanda, are you part of the Ardrossan Castle Heritage Society? Am I right in assuming that? Had said that they are open. Oh, the secretary for the Ardrossan Castle Heritage Society. Fantastic. They're open at Halloween. So if anybody is interested in that, David specifically, but of course anyone else, if anyone else is interested in that, that could be a very interesting
Sounds great. Yeah, I'd love to attend.
Right. So let me just run through. We have, some more. And thank you. Sharon says thank you. Right. And yeah, Amanda said she'll send some details. Right. So, and again, just before we pass over to the audience for questions, I would just like to ask David, if you have any sources. I know you've mentioned a lot of sources throughout your talk, and that's fantastic, but maybe anything you'd recommend for our audience if anyone is looking to look into castle architecture. I know you mentioned McGibbon and Ross. That's a great place to start. But you know, some, or you know, 15th century political landscape, any sources that you could recommend for people that are just sort of looking to learn a little bit more about these topics?
Sure thing. I can post I can send around the bibliography that I used for the dissertation, if that'd be helpful. And if it's not too awkward, if you bear with me for like 30 seconds, I'll go pull a few books off my shelves that would be quite helpful. So I'll scoot away, but I'll be right back, and I should have a few that will make for good reading. Other shelf on the other side of the room. All right, so a few that cover various aspects. If you want something extremely comprehensive, which looks primarily, hence the name, at the martial side of things, you can understand how fortifications as well as weaponry developed throughout more or less every area of Scottish history. This absolute tome is a good one, which is a military history of Scotland, which, there we go. Yeah, I figured it might be on a few people's shelves. That is edited by Edward Spears, Jeremy Crang, and Matthew Strickland. A top-notch read. I've got a few others on my shelf in the corridor, but I'll stick to the ones in this room for now, is Scotland's Castle Culture, which is edited by Audrey Dakin, Miles Glendinning, and Angus McKechnie. That gets into the perception of castles, and a lot of the things that I discussed in terms of the symbolic protection of authority are covered very, very well in Scotland's castle culture. A really fantastic series which gives background to the political developments, again, throughout various ages of Scottish history, is a series, I believe it's a 5-volume series, and there's a series which has some academic articles, and then a series with primary sources is The Making and Unmaking of the Nation, circa 1100 to 1707. I've got 2 of the volumes here. One is major documents, so that is a lot of primary sources. And then this one, for instance, is the Scottish nation origins to circa 1500. So that goes into a lot of the political history, the way that nobility developed, ways which the monarchy was increasingly trying to exert its influence, all that good stuff. Katie Stevenson's Power and Propaganda also comes to mind as an especially helpful source, but I will post my full bibliography so you can read to your heart's content.
That is fantastic, thank you. And I will post the links to the ones that you've just mentioned, or some of the ones you've just mentioned, in the chat for anyone that is looking for those specifically. And you'll be able to see, if you follow David, you'll be able to see his full bibliography. So
yeah. Another one that comes to mind, and I could do this could go on all night, is, I just want to make sure I get the title right.
Just using Waterstones for the details, guys. So
there you go.
You don't have to get them off of Waterstones, but I'll send you the Waterstones links just so you have the book details.
There you are. But yeah, another quite helpful one, which mostly looks prior to the 15th century, so you can get some good context for what was going on earlier, is Geoffrey Barrow's Robert Bruce and the Community of the Realm of Scotland. I would consider that essential reading.
That's great. Thank you so much. Right, we will open up to questions then. Does anyone have any questions for David after that absolutely fantastic talk? Feel free to, you can type them in the chat, or you can feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself.
It's been a few months since I wrapped the dissertation up, so I'll hopefully be able to answer any that come in, but I may have to do the old, I'll get back to you on that. If it's a very specific point. Lots has happened in the last half year.
Nothing just yet. In which case, I mean, I have a list, so I can kick us off. I just thought I'd be nice and, put it out there. But I'll kick off the discussion then if everyone's still thinking. First, thank you for mentioning Walter FitzAlan. I'm not sure if you're aware, you might be aware, but he built the first castle at Dundonald. So that's a nice little link back to us. Also the Montgomerys, I don't know too much about their earlier history, but they, the 9th and 10th Earl lived at Auckins. So shamelessly, I'm going to tie all this back to Dundonald, everyone. So if you're interested in the later history of the Montgomerys, Dundonald, so yeah. Right. I have a couple questions, and I'll start with this one, I guess. You had spoken a bit about the sort of 2 towers options versus that one, everything kind of under one roof. And I wondered if in your travels or your studies, you've noticed any preference for one style or the other in any region of the country or in any time period. So, later in the 15th or 16th century, do they tend to go towards one or the other?
Yeah, the 2 towers approach does seem to be primarily a late medieval concept. I'm not aware of too many examples of that from before sort of the end of the 14th century. It does require an awful lot of resources, of course, to build a castle complex of that magnitude. But most of them, like at Doon, do tend to come in sort of end of the 14th into the beginning of the 15th century. Arguably, you could say that the complex household under one roof model was kind of the default for a lot of areas, especially your in your own work, Blythe, with tower houses. What is a tower house if not a complex household under one roof, but of course with the secondary structures supporting it? So I would argue that the sort of one tower approach is very much the norm, and we see that even in early castles of enclosure and courtyard castles in the 13th century, like many of the galley castles in on the west coast, places like Skipness, like Sween, like Dunstaffnage, like Cheerham, did have a courtyard, but the main noble residence and even some of the service and high status accommodation was very much within the tower. The tower in those cases often being added in sort of the 13th century to an earlier castle of enclosure, which would have just been a courtyard. So the one tower approach is much more common, and the 2 tower approach does tend to require quite a bit by way of resources and time, and does tend to be more of a late medieval phenomenon.
It's really interesting. Thank you. We have a couple in the chat now. Sharon asked, so many castles seem to have been slighted by or under Robert the Bruce to stop them being made use of by our enemies, so the English, so it's in the Wars of Independence. Is there any evidence of that happening to either of these?
Not that I've encountered, no. Bearing in mind that the documentary evidence for both Crookston and Ardrossan castles is pretty slim, prior really to the late 14th century, which, you could argue is, a bit of a bias in my study, because tons could have been going on before that we just don't know about, unfortunately. But you're absolutely right that Robert the Bruce, very enthusiastically slighted castles left, right, and centre. Famously, by the time he was through with Edinburgh Castle, after Thomas Randolph was able to retake it from the English garrison, cattle apparently grazed on Castle Hill for nearly 2 decades afterwards. He was that thorough with it. And that really came down to the disparity in resources. He simply did not have the men or the means to occupy castles. And so his philosophy was, right, if it's no good to me, I'm certainly not going to let it be any good to Edward I. So I can't have it, no one can. So he did slight many, many castles. If you want to look to probably the 2 individuals historically who probably turned the most castles into castle ruins, you're probably looking at Robert the Bruce, and then much later, of course, in the mid-17th century, Cromwell. Between the 2 of them, hundreds of castles slighted or destroyed all throughout the country.
I'm going to shamelessly go back to Dundonald here again and say, Sharon, that if that's something that interests you, Dundonald's, there is some evidence, and again, we don't know, again, documentary evidence is a bit rocky, but Alexander the Fourth High Steward's castle, which is the one previous to the one that we have now, there is evidence that what was there would have been knocked down maybe even a couple of times under James V High Steward during the Wars of Independence period, before, it was left empty for a while before the current castle was built. So sorry about that, but gonna get Dundonald in there. Right. We have Tracy asking if there's a book you would recommend about the social history of castles during the 15th to the 17th centuries.
Yeah, so the social history of castles is a side I've not done too much research on, but what there tends to be, and if anyone's aware of one that I'm missing, please do shout, that we tend to get snippets rather than sort of whole works focusing on that side of things. I know there are some books whose titles I can't recall off the top of my head, looking more at English castles. For Scottish castles, I'm not aware of any, but there probably is some floating out there. One book that does give a few glimpses into that side of things is Scotland, Her Story. And that is edited by Rosemary Goring. And there are a few episodes, as it were, in there where we get occasionally a first-person perspective where they are either dwelling in or involved in some way with a castle, but it's relatively few and far between. I'll see if I can track some down for the bibliography that I post there.
I'm trying to think. I do mostly English castles, so I should know this, but it's coming up with them off the top of your head. That's there's the rise of the castle and decline of the castle that are kind of the big ones. But
one that could be helpful in that regard is Robert Lydiard's, he is the editor of the work Late Medieval Castles. I'll see if I can track down a link to that. And that does go into some of the social history, although it is somewhat focused on the more sort of that old debate of martial versus domestic and the symbolic projection of power and all that kind of stuff.
That is a lot of what you're going to find, isn't it?
It is, yeah, that does tend to dominate. I've got the link, so I can post that in the chat unless you've got it already. Here we go.
No, I've posted the Scotland Her Story, but I've not got that one. So
there we are. Yeah, Late Medieval Castles was pretty crucial for my research. So that applies hopefully both for the social history aspect as well as more generally for just anyone wanting to understand what was going on with castles in the late medieval period.
Are there any other questions then for David before we let him go? Right. Well, I want to say another massive thank you. That was so interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time and for joining us tonight. And before everyone heads off, I just want to say a couple of things. One, we are so excited to let you know that we are going to be working towards getting all of our recordings put publicly, so all of our talks recordings released publicly. So instead of them just being available to members, they'll all be on our YouTube publicly, including this one. So if there are any bits you'd like to go back and see, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, this will be available on our YouTube and our social media. So keep an eye out. And also our next speaker will be Aislinn Cudlin. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh, and she will be, nice Halloween theme again, talking about witchcraft in Dundonald on the 21st of October at 7 p.m. So again, Thursday night, 7 p.m., same time, same place. If you are interested in that, then please come back. And thank you so much, David.
Thank you. Really enjoyed being here. Thanks everyone for your interest. Always happy to geek out about castles.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.